All right. Hello, everyone. This is Nestle Hum from CogIST, which is a community where students and professionals from various fields of study gather around to make resources based on cognitive sciences more accessible and provide students a way of communication with the events we hold throughout the year, such as academic cognition, which is a series of talks preferably given by undergrads and grad students who are relatively less recognized, book cognition, that provides an opportunity for professors and students to exchange ideas revolving around a book of choice for several weeks, and Growing Up in Science, where professors share their lifelong experiences about the academic life. You can follow our accounts on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and you can also support us from the patreon.com, and we would truly appreciate your support. Today's event, named the Cognitive Webinar, is designed to be online and held entirely in English, aiming for an international audience. We would like to provide a platform not just for science communication, but also interaction of academics from all over the world. Today, we're going to listen to Dr. Inês Hipólito, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Berlin School of Mind and Brain. Her research interests are on the intersection between philosophy of mind and computational cognitive neuroscience. Her postdoctoral research focuses on investigating interactions ways to understand cognition. More specifically, her research focuses on embodied cognitive science, complex systems theory, and free energy principle to investigate to what extent cognition can be understood in terms of unfolding dynamic interactions that adjust and adapt. Today, we're going to listen to her talk entitled Eliminativism about neural representations. Her talk will last about an hour, and then we will give a 5-minute break. After the short break, we will proceed with the Q&A session, which will approximately last about 30 minutes. Before we begin, I would like to emphasize the fact that we would like our attendees to ask their questions, their microphones and video cameras open if possible, but it's not a requirement. You can also ask questions through the Zoom chat as well. And Dr. Hipólito, takes us away whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, and of course for inviting me to be here today and share a little bit of my thinking and my work. I will now share my screen. So here we go. I think it's working well. Yeah.
Yep, it's working.
Okay. Good. Okay. So yeah, the title of my talk is going to be Eliminativism about neural representation. And I do want to say that we don't need it, but let me argue for it and then see if I can convince you in the end. This is a work that is mostly in this paper that was just out, Cognition Without Neural Representation, Dynamics of a Complex System. So if you're interested later on in a little bit more about what I'm saying here today, so this is one paper that relates to it. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my claim and what I want to convince you of. I want to say that there are fundamental differences between two constructs, one of mental representation and the other one of neural representation. And I want to also say that we should eliminate one of them, neural representations. The concept of neural representations is, as I am going to try to show, is not very well defined in the literature, but we can say that it is something along the lines, or usually people use it loosely as something like a group of neurons or a neuron that can generate patterns of activity that represent information about stimuli. So something like that. I want to give some preliminaries to set up the stage for what I want to say next. So first, I'm going to do that. I'm going to give you some preliminaries about the brain-computer metaphor, so where we are coming from a little bit of a history of cognitive science. And then I want to look for some definitions of mental representation and look for and not finding definitions for neural representation. And then I'm going to try to show that there are two ways in which neural representation is usually used in neuroscientific practice. One is as an ontological assumption, and the other one is as an epistemic tool. And then I want to make the point that neural patterns activity should not be seen as being neural representations. Okay, so let's do some preliminaries about the brain-computer metaphor, just to remind ourselves that this is the received view. So this is what we are living right now is the era of the mind-like computation, and it dates back to the beginning of the cognitive revolution. The brain-computer metaphor actually helped a lot at the time to offer a conceptual toolkit for cognitivism to push back against behaviorism. So we were lacking those tools. Okay, so then now we enter the cognitivism era with the brain-computer metaphor, and cognitivism is the program that states that cognition is information processing, and it is not like cognition is as if it was information processing, but it is taken in the very literal sense. Cognition is rule-based manipulation of symbols. And it works through any device which can support and manipulate discrete physical elements such as symbols. A system is thereby functioning adequately as cognitive, or a system is cognitive when the symbols appropriately represent some aspects of the real world, and their information processing leads to successful solution of the problem posed to the system. So this is a kind of a loose understanding of the brain-computer metaphor as it started. Of course, today it is much more nuanced and integrated than this, but we're going to see that. Okay, so at the time, many computer scientists and mathematicians contributed to the toolkit. For example, one of them was John von Neumann with his book, The Computer and the Brain. And there he says, computation is or as to operate on numbers according to a predetermined plan. Right, so we have a little bit of what we have now in cognitivism, which is syntax and semantics. The thing that is quite interesting, the detail that I found recently, is that despite von Neumann's contribution to the toolkit of cognitivism, he always resisted the metaphor that he helped create. So it's actually that he was this landmark in cognitivism, and yet he was the one resisting the metaphor. And he actually said that this metaphor will be absolutely implausible on the account of the distance between a biological system and the computer. So then when we look at, for example, what Gualtiero Piccinini tells us when he reviews his book, he says that, and I think it's quite an accurate remark, which is writing in 1950s, von Neumann didn't clarify what he had in mind. And then many scientists adopted his language with the same lightheartedness, right? So it's quite interesting how things go when we do a little bit of history of cognitive science. Gradually, what happens is that the computer brain metaphor metamorphoses into a literal sense. So it starts ceasing to be a metaphor to begin to be a sort of a literal, taken on a literal sense, by which neural activity ought to be machine-like computation. And this reasoning becomes so pervasive in cognitive science that it becomes hard to see any other options in the field. So while neurobiological transduction could be seen as involving some kind of biological computation following von Neumann ways as well, there's this very, the biology and computation are quite far apart. So we could say, well, there is some kind of biological computation given the distance between biological system and the human-made computer. Biological activity should not be described or defined in terms of the ways that we use to refer to how a computer computes. So this is following von Neumann's reasoning. And it's quite interesting because we do see this quite pervasive and loosely way of thinking about these activities, these biological activities. And one of them is this extraordinary study by this wonderful researcher, Santosh Manika and Michael Levin. So what they do in this wonderful paper is that they claim that there is a minimal non-neural bioelectric network model that utilizes the general principles of bioelectricity, electrodiffusion and gating, and that it can compute right? Okay, so note what they're saying. There is a non-neural bioelectric network model that can compute. That's what they're saying. And that will be quite okay, but we need to take some stake on this. This evidence coming from their work and their follow-up work, because they have new work on this that is really cool. But following this, this work, we could think about it like this. So for one, neurobiological activity is actually in neurochemistry of thermodynamic energy transfer. And if this non-neural biological activity is computational, and neurobiological activity is computational. So see what we're doing? We're saying that neurobiology is in biology, and they kind of come down to being of the same kind. Then computation is neurochemistry of thermodynamic energy transfer. So what is the point here? The point is that if we must use the notion of computation, because of our anthropomorphic ways of thinking neurobiology, if we must use the notion of computation to refer to neurobiological activity, it must be such that it must apply to all scales of neurobiology, right? Which means deflating the notion of computation to the extent that it becomes nothing like a computer, which was in the end or in the beginning or in the early days what von Neumann was already telling us. So it's quite interesting to think about it. However, according to the orthodoxy of these machine-like analogies, which is the mainstream or the received view in contemporary cognitive science, cognition is conceived as a product of an information-based process that unfolds to the end of computing intelligible representations. And then we've got here, like on the bottom, a bunch of references of people that would endorse this view. This view is so received and so ingrained in computational cognitive neuroscience that one would seem mad to question it. So basically right now I am that person in the room. I am the mad person that is questioning this, right? Rodney Brooks, very well-known roboticist, even said about that some might say that that's because computation makes us blind. So that's quite an interesting paper of his. So, but then the question is, while the notion of mental representation is quite a live issue in cognitive neuroscience, and particularly in philosophy of mind, there's lots of debates, a lot has been written on mental representation. The question then is, okay, is there a definition for neural representation, since we are very committed to using this machine-like view of the brain? So, okay, what does it look like when we talk about a neural representation, which is supposed to be the output of these computational machine-like computation happening in the brain? So what is it that we're talking about when we refer to neural representation? What is this concept? Okay. So many people have acknowledged that the concept of neural representation is freely used in neuroscience. It's commonly employed to refer to neural activity and connectivity structures. And while, as we just said, the notion of mental representation is highly discussed, the notion of neural representation is way less defined. So let me just say a few words about what mental representation is, so that then we can think about, oh, okay, is there like an overlap between them? When we say neural representation, do we mean mental representation, or just what is it? What is the relation between them, if any? Mental representation, as it is defined in philosophy of mind, is a basic concept in classic computational theory of mind that was come through the hands of Fodor and Filshin at the foundations of cognitivism in cognitive science. A mental representation, as classically conceived, is an object with semantic properties. Of course, then this changes a little bit later on with the connectionism, but at the primordial stance, then it must have these semantic properties. We can talk about that a little bit later, which means that it has representational content and it refers to some object, thereby having truth conditions and truth value. So for those that are not very familiarized with philosophy of mind, these terms that I just used, they are pervasive. They are everywhere when in the debates of philosophy of mind on mental representation. Examples of mental representation are a thought, a belief, a drawing, or a map. So when we engage with the world such that we are trying to represent it as being such and such, right? Like drawing, like believing, like making a statement. So those are mental representations. And these are all forms of engaging with the world in a representational way. Now, what we have when it comes to the case of mental representation and the mind-computer metaphor in philosophy of mind, we have different flavors, right? So it's a little bit like pick your poison. Which one do you think that is more plausible or stronger? It's a stronger case, right? Okay, so we have at the very beginning, we have classic computationalism, which was put forward by The Modularity of the Mind by Jerry Fodor, and this is actually a literal application of Turing machines mechanisms, and it contends that what drives mental representations are symbols, are semantic properties, are symbols, right? Then later on, we have the connectionist inspired approaches, and these are inspired in parallel distributed processing. And it takes mental representations as distributed processes in a network whose causal structure corresponds to a mental representation. And then we have the predictive accounts of cognition a little bit more recently, which also we have a variety of them. And this, what it does, or anybody in this business, what they do is they apply predictive coding terminology to contend that representations are model-like theorizing predictions or representations, right? Okay, so what you see here is quite interesting because I don't know if you noticed, but every single one of them, what they do is they pick up what is the best technology of their time and they apply that to explain the mind, right? So you see with classic computationalism, they apply Turing machines technology, and then with connectionism, parallel distributed processing, then with predictive accounts, predictive coding, right? So I wonder, or one could wonder whether we ever have really truly a theory of the mind itself without technology in computer science. Okay, but that's just a side. Okay, so what they have in common, all of these different flavors, what they have in common is the endorsement of the mind-machine metaphor in different ways, of course. One is super symbolic, the other one is super syntactic, and the other one is super predictive coding. So in different ways, the brain is, or the mind is a machine, whether it is analog, digital, predictive, or something in between. Well, no one from the more recent, say, radical trends in cognitive science, like embodied in enactive cognitive science, so no one from those more radical embodied in enactive cognitive science denies that some forms of engagement with the world involve representational structures with symbolic content. So nobody in cognitive science or in philosophy of mind would deny that thinking or writing an essay or solving an equation or drawing a map entails representational structures. Nobody would deny that. A mental representation is something that happens and occurs on the agent level as people interact with the world. What is open for discussion and what divides people on this matter is whether this activity of writing an essay, solving an equation, reduces to mental representation, right? In which case the embodied and enactive cognitive science would say that, well, it doesn't reduce to mental representation, but that would be for a different talk. Okay, so the question is, and what brings us here, I was just giving some preliminaries on mental representation so that then we can map out and see where we are on the notion of neural representation, whether it is an overlap, it's a match, or nothing like that, right? So just some preliminaries on mental representation. And while all of those discussions, they refer to mental representation, then what we want to ask and what we want to think about is about the notion of neural representation. Which is less defined. So let's define of a conceptual tool. How is it used in neuroscientific practice at all? Right, okay. So due to the lack of definitions in the literature for the notion of neurorepresentation, I'm just going to work with these as follows, which I thought was doing some research and homework. I thought that it was general enough, but also specific enough that it would get what it seems that people are after when in neuroscience they apply this notion, which I already mentioned, something like a group of neurons or a neuron. There are a lot of people that also mention like a single neuron can generate patterns of activity that represent information about stimuli. So something along those lines. That's the best that I can do because there is not really a definition. But if you know of any, I'm really happy to hear. So the ways in which the concept of neurorepresentation is used in neuroscience can be grouped in two possible methodological strategies. One is as an ontological assumption, and the other one is as an epistemic tool. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to explain each one of them, and I'm going to say that none of them is useful to the study of neural connectivity and activity. So as an ontological assumption, what does that mean? Okay, a little bit of ontology. Scientists work with an ontology. And I quite like this, this quote by Popper because it really puts things on point, because sometimes neuroscientists kick this ball of like, oh, I don't know what a neural representation is, but also I don't care because I do something else. This is for philosophers, right? But what Karl Popper tells us is something that I find really important, which is regardless of or whether or not we scientists in the lab think about the concepts or not, one thing is for sure, we all have our philosophies, whether or not we are aware of this fact. And our philosophies are not worth very much. But the impact of our philosophies upon our actions and our lives is often devastating. So imagine having our own philosophies that are not really thought through, carefully, rigorously analyzed or assessed in our labs. That would be, following Popper, a little bit of a problem. So Paul Druck was recently the one that I also acknowledged is rightly saying that the concept of representation is freely used in neuroscience, and the concept is not used across the board. He says the concept of representation is used broadly and then controversially throughout neuroscience, in contrast to its highly controversial status within the philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Yeah, that's pretty much the case. And while he is right to say that, it is also the case that the concept of neurorepresentation or computation is not used across the board in neuroscience. There are other ways, and there are other possibilities that I would like also to talk about a little bit, but I don't have lots of time, so I'm mostly here to point out where the concept is not useful. The concept of representation is rejected by some neuroscientists explaining neural activity without calling up the notion of representation. And you can see that from examples of it are these ones right here on the bottom, but I could give you much more. And I'm going to give a little bit more detail on that precisely by focusing on one quite curious study by the well-known Walter Friedman and Christine Scava. And in this curious paper titled "Representations, Who Needs Them?" It's quite interesting because it's like they come in this paper, they come to a point of like, after working for 20 years trying to find something, they realize something, and I find this absolutely extraordinary in science. We have found that thinking of brain function in terms of representation seriously impedes progress toward genuine understanding. Such interpretation is misleading. After years of sifting through our data, we identified the problem. It was the concept of representation. Once we stopped looking at neural patterns as representations of odorants, we began to ask a new set of questions. Yeah, so those who actually do the opposite of this and spend all these years precisely looking to find those representations or explanations of neural activity as if they entailed those representational structures. What they do is they endorse the notion of representation as something that exists in the brain. And when they do that, in philosophy, we say that they're making an ontological statement about something. And in this case, it's an ontological statement about a brain activity. So you suppose that there are representations in the brain somewhere. It can be a group of neurons, it can be a single neuron, but you suppose that. And then you're going to go out and conduct experiments in order to find it. And then you're going to permeate your explanations in order to make sense of the results through the notion of that you already predefined as a representation. So you're already working with an ontological statement. Philosophically, this statement is in alignment with the scientific realist view, supposing that our scientific tools have a real referent, these representational concepts have a real referent in the brain. Okay, so recent work on scientific realism, just to give a little bit of, if anybody's interested, the idea here when we say, well, they're making an ontological statement about neural representations, what does that mean? Okay, so we have, for example, this book on research methods in social sciences, and one of the papers quite interesting is on scientific realism. And while there are many views on realism focused on aspects, different aspects of science, for this particular case, focusing on the ontological aspect is what is most useful for us to understand what is it that scientists are doing when they're using the notion of neural representation. Metaphysical realists have long maintained that the world is real. And while reality may be independent of concepts, our concepts can make references to it and its essences. So that's the kind of relation that we are talking about when we sort of like front load our investigation of neural activity as having or must-have representations. So with this in mind, and according to scientific realism, science aims and is able to uncover the true or approximate true organization of the world. So that's kind of like what I've just said. What does it mean to say that there are representations? So applying the notion of representation to neural activity is going to take the form of making an ontological claim that is legitimized by scientific realism. So what is happening when scientists say, when neuroscientists say, well, I'm just going to use these because for whatever reason, makes sense. And I'm not going to really think about it because that's what philosophers do. So then philosophers would reply saying that, well, you're making an ontological claim that is legitimized by scientific realism. Applying this notion of representation to neural activity takes the form of making this ontological claim. So now what we should do is we should look at the differences between, if any, between mental representation, which is something that, like I said, is like thinking, believing, drawing, something that happens on the agent level, right? That's a mental representation. And what is on the other side, the notion of a neural representation. Do they share any properties or not? So at least so that we can find some kind of ground to offer some kind of definition. So mental representations are something like, as we saw, something like, so people that endorse these mental representations through and through, they would say that regardless of whether we are realist about representational theories of the mind, we have compelling reasons to endorse entity realism about mental representation. So this would be those sitting on the most extreme side of mental representations in a realist way, right? So let's see what happens, for example, when we talk about the Bayesian brain, right? Bayesian models vary widely in their scientific merit, but many are well confirmed and explanatorily superior to non-Bayesian alternatives. We have good reason to believe that these models are approximately true. So basically what is happening here is that both of them are making a realist claim. One is making a realist claim for mental representations. These exist regardless. And the other one is making a realist claim for a neural representation, which exists regardless. But we still haven't gotten any definition. We're just doing a little bit of philosophy. Okay, so scientific realism about representation just means that we're talking about models being true, and whatever is true for the model is going to be true as well for the target system. So Yeah, so that's basically what it is. But then let's just scrutinize that a little bit further. So what we want to do now is scrutinize this scientific realism about models when we try to explain the brain, and whether or not, or what does it mean to say, or to endorse neurorepresentation from an ontological perspective as something that exists in the brain. I must find it, and my data is going to be explained by this concept, and it cannot survive, or I cannot explain my data without using this concept. Okay, so what is happening is, well, one thing is ontology and the other one is scientific realism. Let's see how. Okay, so let's start with, I'm going to say that I'm going to use these representational structures because I am this neuroscientist who is not interested in doing any philosophy. That's for philosophers to do. Okay, I'm just here to test my stuff, to conduct my experiment, to collect my data, and then to use a model to make sense of my data. That's what I'm here to do. Okay, so philosophers think about it. Okay, so I'm going to use the notion of representational structures, neurorepresentation, for reasons that I think are justified. And then I'm going to develop a model to explain the neural activity, where the activity X is represented in the model, of course, as Y. So as some kind of like representational activity that I suppose that there is there. So imagine I run the experiment, I collect my data, I develop my model, and then I would like my model to explain the data in a reasonable way. I want my model to be viable and explain whatever activity that is completely hidden to me that generated that data in the end. That's what I want, right? So then I developed this model by using my own agential, because I'm an agent, I'm a scientist. I use that model with representational structures, right? And then in the end, I may or may not have a good explanation of the data, right? So what happens is that then it's like almost as if there was a button, and then you would click apply scientific realism here, and then you would say that those representational structures that you used in the model also exist in the brain. So it's not only the case that I've used my mental capacity to make sense, reason about, use mathematics and all of that to explain the data, but also everything that there is in my model, including representations, must exist in the target system. So this is a scientific realism move. Okay, so then it looks something like this. Okay, if we translate it in logics, it looks something like this. According to scientific realism, science aims and is able to uncover the truth, right? If the model is true, then its properties must refer to something in the world, right? I can't just have a model that doesn't refer to anything in the world. The model is representational, or the scientists use representational structures. There's dispute here. We can allow for both to build a model. So the model can be we can either say, oh, my model represents the brain, or we can say, oh, my model uses representational structures. It doesn't matter for this argument. And the conclusion is that then there are representations in the brain. There is neural representation. So this is sort of like putting together, like using logics, the sort of reasoning behind using neural representation as an ontological commitment. Okay, so then we do things like this. So because we use that in a way that is not even a metaphor anymore, then we do things like saying, neurons are representation units where information is represented in the firing rates, right? So it ceases to be something that exists in the model because there was a scientist with this reasoning skill. And realism. So then we have all of these assemble of these three features. right? And then we have in classic computationalism a network of computations taking place in neural activity that are supposed to deliver representations with semantic content, which are communicated to higher computational systems, which are neural cells that can generate and interpret symbols, which is, if you ask me, extremely weird, because how can cells interpret symbols in the same sense that we as agents do, of course. And then we have cognitivist inspired approaches, which is mostly these causal structures of topologies that are driving or leveraging the representational process. This is slightly different because here it's not semantics that is driving the representational process, but it's syntax. And that's what we have with neural networks today. And then we have predictive coding, which is the view of representation as these probabilistic structures. So there are different flavors for this. The thing is, or the problem that might be here is that when we remove the notion of mental representation and sort of like substitute, because it seems like a replacement by neural representation, plus endorsing the mind-computer metaphor, plus endorsing realism, what happens is that we might be attributing full agent capacities to neural structures, right? Okay, so then you can do a slightly different move and you can say, oh, it's all of that, but it's not really realism, it's deflationary realism, which is something that is more recent. And this is by, for example, seeing representations as part of an idealized model. Deflationary realism avoids the problems with the robust realist views, which is something interesting to think about if you are interested, but I have to let it here. Okay, so, right. So then one thing that I can say is that, okay, so people can endorse neural representations as an ontological property of the brain. Of course, they're free, they can do that. But why shouldn't they do it? Okay. Now here I'm sort of like jumping on dynamical systems bandwagon of Van Helder, and it's quite interesting that it quite spells out for us what is happening, right? What general arguments are in favor of the idea of neural processes that they must be computational, representational in nature? Well, it tells us that neural activity as being representational is typically given in the form of a general argument, right? Okay, so basically the underlying assumption is that it's not really always the case, maybe it's actually rarely the case, that we are given a specific argument for the existence, the ontological existence of neural representation, other than being sort of like borrowed from our models. And then the other one is, the other kind of general argument is the what else could it be, right? What else could be neural activity if not neural representation? So then for the first one, I went to do a little bit of homework and I went to see, okay, let me go and have a look on the textbooks with which we are teaching new generations in our universities. We're teaching cognitive psychology, we're teaching cognitive science. So let me look at the textbooks and see if Van Helder is right, when he says that the statement or the claim that neural activity is representational is typically given in the form of a general argument. So then I find things like in this book, for example, which is textbook for cognitive science pays particular attention to intelligent behavior as computation and is thereby associated with machines that can compute. So this is what we are telling everybody in our universities. Next one, a companion to cognitive science. Cognitive science holds general assumptions that the mind is information processing system, a representational device, and in some sense, a computer. So the thing is that it can be the case that the mind or the brain is a computer. It could be the case. The thing is that we need to offer a proper argument for that, not a general argument that we just state as if it was the case. So we need to offer that proper, specific, strong argument or make it a scientific fact. And from what we've seen, we are using this concept, but let's also get to that. Or we see people saying things like this in explaining the computational mind. We see some tautologies. The mind can be explained computationally because it is computational. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know about you, but it doesn't work for me. Then while it has clearly served the purpose in the history of cognitive psychology to supporting cognitivism against behaviorism, the notion of neural representation has absolutely no use for example, connectionism, because you could say, oh, okay, that was really useful back in the day when cognition or neural activity was in a symbolic, but now with connectionism and neural networks and deep learning, etc., representation is still quite useful. Well, what you find in that paper by Van Helder is that actually it was quite useful to the battle against behaviorism, but it is not as useful for connectionism because we're talking about causal networks. So it is a little bit surprising that connectionists still also really can't let it go. While connectionism-inspired models of the brain emerge as the promised alternative to the classical theory of mind and that all that cognitivist toolkit, they have no explicit quarrels with behaviorism whatsoever. So why invoke that notion of representation? Cognition as a neural activity is typically conceived as representational under the assumption that there is no alternative. This is the second one that he says, well, for the claim that neural activity must be computational. He says, well, usually actually that kind of like is let slide because of the what else could it be argument. Because then we have people like Alan Newell saying something like, although a small chance exists that we will see a new paradigm emerging for mind, it seems unlikely to me. Basically, there do not seem to be any viable alternatives to the computational theory of mind. The question is, are there any alternatives to the mind-computer metaphor? Right? Because if there aren't, then maybe we need to be pursuing that line of reasoning and find much more evidence for it and formulate better arguments, more precise. But if there are, then we might also want to explore those. So some other that come to mind, top of the head, we don't really have to dig too much, is dynamical systems theory or complex systems theory, where it explicitly goes again the computational theory of mind or any of that machine-like metaphors. And it is a whole coherent framework, mathematically rigorous. So, I mean, that would be something to at least consider. Van Helder tells us about the way that the mind and brain are instead understood as a dynamical system. He says that rather than computation, cognitive processes may be dynamical systems. Rather than computation, cognitive processes may be state space evolution within these very different kinds of systems. And then you have a bunch of work in varied cognitive functions, development, brain activity, psychopathology, etc., etc. So it might be worth having a check on that. And you see also a lot of other work here as well. So that was sort of like the voyage to tell a little bit about what we are doing in our neuroscience labs when we say that there are, and I need to find them, neural representations. So what we are doing is making ontological claims, and we are endorsing scientific realism. It may be or may not be the case that that's the right way to go. I don't think that there is, because I am not convinced. The second way of using neural representations in the literature is to endorse it as a scientific tool, okay? So what does that mean? Well, some people might say, well, even if neural representations are not an ontological thing, they might still be useful. And that's precisely what we get with this paper, for example. What makes representations useful? Across disciplines, one common thread is that representations are typically useful in some sense. Okay, so let me just check the time. Oh, I see. Okay, try to run this real quick. So here the idea is that, okay, it's just not really a thing that there is actually out there, but it's quite useful as a conceptual tool. Okay. The thing is that while metaphors can in principle be useful to elucidate upon a problem on, for example, a pre-scientific phase or a pre-paradigm formation phase, they're not really scientific tools. They definitely can help us to think things that are too abstract or too ambiguous or too intangible. Then we use these metaphors to aid thinking, right? But when should we let go of the metaphor and keep going and doing science instead? We're often under cognitivism given the impression that by saying that neural activity is representation, and this is the problem, we have explained the scientific phenomenon of interest. If I say, well, neural activity is representation, and these and these and these are representations of that and that and that, it seems that we are under the spell of thinking that we have explained the phenomenon. The metaphor of neurons as representations devices is, however, misleading, right? And that's what I want to say, that, yeah, people might be wanting to use it as a tool, but be careful because it might be misleading. Not only it is important to scientifically advance understanding past the metaphor, but this particular metaphor is misleading. Because, why? Well, because it front loads research into finding this metaphor in the brain, into finding the one thing that we have exaggerated that does not exist in order to make it intelligible for us. Now, I'm going to go back to this paper because I find it absolutely fascinating. So this is, again, Walter Friedman, and it tells us that studies of the olfactory system, and sorry, let me just make this point. And this is a way in which it is misleading. After years and years of trying to explain a certain phenomenon in the brain, you realize that, well, it was a waste of time because we were actually looking for something that does not exist in the brain. So is it useful after all? I don't know. That's for you to decide. But anyway, Friedman tells us studies in the olfactory system using EEG show a brief oscillatory burst of potential that accompanies each inhalation, which they link to a burst of energy carried by a wave of neural activity at a common frequency, while each burst exists over the entire bulb or cortex, which with a spatial pattern of amplitude that varies from one burst to the next. And they have shown that a stereotypical pattern recurs whenever a particular odorant is presented at that the animal has been trained to respond to. So I think that here the important concept is that there is a pattern that occurs given a certain arrangement of things. And now here, this is the most interesting part, because it's when they kind of reason about the results that they get when they let go finally of finding this notion of representations in the brain that would explain the olfactory system. So neural activity patterns of the olfactory bulb cannot be equated with internal representations of particular odorants in the world for three reasons. And that's exactly, this is quoting them. This is in the paper. It's just, it seems that with the odor, it seems to make it more relevant or more important for us to see that representations do not really do the trick as it does with the visual system. So neural patterns of the olfactory bulb cannot be equated with internal representations for three reasons. Simply presenting an odorant to the system does not lead to any odor-specific activity patterns. Only when the stimulus is reinforced does it lead to a behavioral change, and thereby neural activity takes place. The second one, odor-specific pattern activity depends upon the behavioral response. Changing reinforcement contingency leads to changes in patterned activity. Patterned activity is context dependent. Introducing a new reinforced odorant to the organism's repertoire leads to changes in the patterns associated with all previously learned odorants. So one thing that we can say, and if you're interested, the paper is really, really cool, is that there are these relational aspects of the way that someone engages with the world and their past odor experiences and the patterns that show up in neural activity. So taken together, these facts teach us that we who have looked at activity patterns as internal representations of events have misinterpreted the data. There is nothing intrinsically representational about this dynamic process until the observer intrudes, which is us. It is the experimenter who infers what the observed activity patterns represent to or in a subject in order to explain his results to himself, right? It's quite interesting because it's going back to that slide that I was showing, which is like setting up the experiment, collecting the data, building up a model to explain the data, and then enforcing the explanation as entailing these representations, which only we as agents could do. Anyway, the metaphor is misleading because a representation is not to be found in the brain, but as of a scientist herself constructing and testing a theory and interpreting results. So the use of the metaphor instead of illuminating gives the impression that we should find in the brain the same form of activity as that used to construct a theory, for example, a model, and theorize about what is going on in the brain. While neuroscientists constructing their models of understanding have been enculturated with symbolic-based skills that allow them to construct symbolic structures and understand the natural world, neurons have not. They have not gone to school and they have not received all of those symbolic capacities. So why would we expect the symbolic structures of understanding to be present in the understanding and that are present in the computational model? Why would we find them in the neurobiological substrates, or to take it even a level further, in biological substrates or structures whatsoever? Patterned neural activity is correlated with forms of interaction in a situational context that is behaviorally and environmentally co-defined. That's what we've learned from Freedom's paper. The idiosyncrasy of the situation cannot be described as computation of domain-specific systems that automatically activate according to a program of certain structural rules of causation, outputting a representation. So then explaining neural patterns of activity while being eliminativist about neural representation, how is that possible? Like I said at the very beginning, it seems that one would be mad or insane to even suggest that we should be eliminativist about neural representation, that we should eliminate it because it's such a pervasive concept in neuroscience. But I will finish here now. I have a few more slides, but I think that we're running out of time. So I'll just finish here now, and I am quite interested to hear your thoughts on the matter. And thank you so much for your attention and for listening.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Hipólito. Actually, if that's okay with you, we can skip the break and then we can actually like continue on with the questions. All right, so does anybody have any questions? You can raise your hand.
Okay, I think I was too mad to question this.
Okay, we have a question from Diego.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I'm kind of right here. I don't know. Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk. It was quite interesting. I wonder where did the EEG in the Freeman paper was located, because the structures are different from olfactory bulb to prefrontal cortex. And later on, and EEG is very coarse, so later on, like decades later, I guess, we can via more precise technology monitor the activity of cells individually, and they are quite a sparse collection of cells is quite sensitive to the presentation of tolerance, regardless of the behavioral context, like reinforcement or learning or so. Indeed, context is still relevant, learning is still relevant. I'm quite sympathetic to anti-representationalism, but given the enhance of precision, we now can see in prefrontal cortex, let it be a mouse or a fish or an insect even. No, insect not so quite defined, but we can map relations between odorants and sparse patterns of a subset of neurons which stops firing or starts firing exactly when or with a lag of the presentation of the stimuli, regardless contextual things like learning or space or the mix of odorants or previous presentations or so on. Sorry for my bad English, it's messy.
No, your English is absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Diego, for your question and for your input. I think, well, so to answer your question, I don't think that they are saying that there would not be possible to have an automatic firing from a certain kind of stimuli. Right. I don't think they're saying that that would not be possible, but as with everything in neurobiology and in perception in particular, it very much depends on the interactions with the world. So it depends on the environment that the organism lives at, it depends on the development of the organism, it depends on the circumstances and all of that. Of course, we know that some things are much more selected by evolution, right? So I don't know if you were going in that direction, but it seemed like it, but correct me if I'm wrong, that while, let's call it training, it's not training, but while there are some relations as Freeman tells us in his work, that there are some sort of like relations between the stimuli and patterns of activity, there might be some other cases in which there is much more selectivity by evolution, where there is as you said, neurons might start firing in a very automatic way. I think that's an interesting question then for that, so that we don't get lost in those muddy waters of representation is, okay, be that as it may, right? When, even if that's the case that neurons start firing given a certain stimuli and they're not much more reinforced or less reinforced, right? Does that give us sufficient reasons to explain that as being a representational structure or mechanism? That's just what I think that we need to think about and question. Maybe it does, right? Maybe it does. But then we need to offer here and now a clear, sound argument for that and not postpone it for tomorrow. Of course, it is quite convenient for us because we are human beings and we speak the language that we speak. So it's quite convenient for us to use the concept, but it can be misleading. So that's just, I'm just being the mad person in the room and questioning this.
No, I see. The question is, what's the alternative? Like the neurons are not representing, okay, the object, but the motivational state of the animal and the ecological relevance or evolutionary relevance of the object in entangled manner, something like that. What's, or not representing, are tracking the word. What's the alternative? The lexicon.
Exactly. It's tough, isn't it? But is it tough because it is tough really, or is it tough because we are so used to using this language? I think you were doing something really good right there, because you were really trying. That's why my talk was about, okay, let's be eliminativist, and then what can we do? Right? It's really an exercise. And I think you were going on the right direction. So, okay, then you have different alternatives. You can, for example, then work with neural networks, right? And like I said, I don't think neural networks, they need to endorse the notion of representation, but mostly they do. I think that works really well. We have learned so much about neural activity through neural networks, frameworks. It's really amazing. I just don't know. I don't think that we need the notion of representations to do all the great work that we've been doing. And then you can go either other directions. You can go with dynamical systems theory. You have a whole system of mathematics and toolkit that allows you to precisely map down those patterns and explain precisely those relations. That's all you need to explain. You need to explain the relations between something that happens to the organism and patterns that occur in the nervous system of that organism. And knowingly, from a systems perspective, knowingly that whatever happens to the organism is going to have an influence and consequences in the whole system. Not only the nervous system as an organ, right? So I think it's, or at least for me, it makes much more sense to take that systems approach. And then as a scientist, go and map out these relations between the world influencing the organism and what patterns do I see?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I thought you were going with Afro dance, but okay, thank you very much.
All right, we have another question from Paolo.
Hola, Inês.
Hello, Paul.
Thanks for your talk. It was
My pleasure.
fantastic. I have, let's say, 2 provocations for you.
Oh, no.
So, oh no. Oh God, this is going so well.
Yeah.
So the first one is, according to what you have been said, the way that neuroscientists do this narrative, would you agree to call it some sort of metaphysical realism? And the second one is, aren't all the scientists, neuroscientists and philosophers writers of metaphors? Isn't it that all the philosophy and all the science has always been written with metaphors? So I'm really sorry to provoke you like this, but I'll really like to hear you.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
what's the fun if not, you know, bringing new ideas and provoking ideas to the table? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I think that the first question that you asked, whether it would be possible to think about it as a metaphysical realism, I think so. And there was in one slide that paper that I was referring to. It really brings that out in that sense. Of course, it all depends on how far you want to take things, because usually the move, for those of you in philosophy in the room, the move usually is when you get pressed and pressed and pressed, you start deflating. You start retrieving and going back, oh no, I didn't mean all this metaphysical thing. But I think that it is possible, because what is this metaphysical realism? Well, it's determining that there are things in the world regardless of, or that are independent of the mind of the person thinking them. What gets so complicated in cognitive science is that we are doing a meta exercise. We are using our mind to think minds.
Yes.
Right. So then we get completely confused in this. And I give you an example of this, which I find extremely elucidating, or it helps with my thinking, which is like everybody in science uses computational modeling. Right. It's super useful. Right, to, I don't know, model the weather, model hurricane, predict the weather. We use models, right? But then what really gets me thinking is that I do not see any weather scientists predicting the weather, claiming that the weather has the representational properties of the model. And yet, here we are in cognitive science, claiming that the properties of the model, which I came up with as a scientist, also exist in the target system. Because it's super meta. And then we get all conflated in all of these levels. That's why I'm like, okay, let's just take a step back and let's think this through. Maybe it is the case that all of the properties of the model exist in the target system, which, by the way, it's the brain. Maybe it is the case, right? But we need to think it through. Are we missing some steps here? Because if we are, it may be the case that what is allowing this kind of thinking is, okay, before the model, I'm going to make some assumptions. We all do in modeling science. We all have to make some assumptions. We all have to use some folk psychology.
Yes.
So let me make some assumptions. I'm going to make some assumptions that the way that I'm going to explain neural activity is through neural representations. And then I conduct all of that important work that I need to conduct. And then by a move of metaphysical realism, I am going to be motivated to find those assumptions, such as neural representations explaining or having a role to play in the interpretation of the results. So that would be for the first question. I think so. I think it can be the case that we are doing that, and I think that paper that I also put it on the slide, on one of the slides, was quite nice. And Paulo, the other question, sorry, I got all now invested in this thinking.
No, it's just a way to provoke your thought, because I think we are really under that meta model that it seems that it really doesn't explain anything. It's just a way of doing, to use your words, to misleading concepts through one another. So it's becoming very confusing.
Yeah, and that's exactly like, don't take any of what I said in this talk for granted. Just go and do that particular, right? Just going and doing that particular work of, okay, so what is it really that we mean here, right? Because it may be the case that it is misleading our work in neuroscience and our understanding it's on the way. Is it necessary? And what do we mean when we do that? So, yeah.
Thank you, Inês. It was a pleasure.
No, my pleasure.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Going once, going twice. I believe that's it. All right. Thank you so much for your talk today. I think it was pretty interesting. And I think at the end we had this like very valuable conversation about like just to further analyze like what you just like talked about. So thank you so much for being with us today. We truly appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure.